There's a specific kind of pain that hits you when you're standing at your own front door in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, after a 10-hour shift, and your key doesn't work anymore. It's not anger, not yet. First, it's confusion. Then it's your stomach dropping somewhere you can't reach. Then you see your mother's face appear behind the window glass, and she looks at you, and she doesn't move to open the door. And right there, in that moment, you understand that some betrayals don't come from enemies. They come gift-wrapped in the word family. If you've ever loved someone who saw your kindness as an open door, stay with me, because this story is for you. My name is Brielle. I'm 34 years old. I work as a radiology technician at Our Lady of the Lake Regional Medical Center, and I own a 3-bedroom house on the east side of Baton Rouge that I bought with my own money, my own credit, and 4 years of sacrifice so quiet and so heavy that most people never even knew I was carrying it. That Tuesday in October, I had just finished a 10-hour shift. My feet were swollen inside my shoes. I hadn't eaten since a granola bar at noon. I remember the drive home so clearly, the way the oak trees along Airline Highway looked almost purple in the early evening light, the way the radio was playing something soft that I wasn't really listening to. I was just thinking about my couch, my blanket, maybe leftover pasta from the night before. I pulled into my driveway and noticed immediately that my mother Ruth Ann's silver Buick was parked along the curb. That alone wasn't unusual. She had been living with me for 14 months by then, what was supposed to be a temporary arrangement after she had a minor cardiac episode the previous August. I had told her she could stay until she felt stable, until she felt ready. I never imagined she would redefine what ready meant entirely on her own terms. I walked up the porch steps, digging through my work bag for my keys the way I always did, half-blind muscle memory. I pulled them out, found the house key, slid it into the lock. It didn't turn. I pulled it out, looked at it. Same key I'd used every single day for 4 years. I tried again. Nothing. The lock resisted like I was a stranger. I looked up at the door, really looked, and that's when I saw it. The lock plate was different, newer, shinier, something that had not been there this morning when I left for work at 6 a.m. My chest went tight. I stepped back, and that's when I saw her, Ruth Ann, standing just inside the front window, half hidden behind the curtain I had picked out myself from a shop on Jefferson Highway. She was looking directly at me, not with guilt, not with panic, with something I can only describe as calculation. Like she was measuring how I would react, I raised my hand. Not waving, just a gesture. Open the door. She let the curtain fall back into place and disappeared into the house. I stood on my own porch for a full 30 seconds. Completely still, the Louisiana evening heat pressing down on my shoulders like a hand. My neighbor across the street, an older man named Mr. Thibodeau, who always waved when I came home, he was on his porch that evening too. But he didn't wave. He looked at me for just a moment, then looked away, like he'd already seen something he didn't want to be part of. That detail hit me harder than I expected, because it meant this wasn't sudden. It meant someone, maybe multiple people, had known something was coming before I did. I pulled out my phone and called Ruth Ann's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice, warm and practiced the way it always was when she was performing normalcy, told me to leave a message. I didn't leave one. I sat down on my own porch steps. My porch, my steps, the ones I had repainted myself 2 summers ago. And I looked out at my quiet street in Baton Rouge as the sky started turning that deep bruised orange it gets just before dark. And something inside me, some last soft piece that had still been hoping this was a misunderstanding, went very, very quiet. This was not a misunderstanding. This was just the moment I finally had to stop pretending it wasn't. To understand what Ruth Ann did that October evening, you have to understand what this house meant to me. And to understand that, you have to go back 4 years, back to the worst and the most quietly powerful year of my life. My father, Gerald, passed away in the spring. Pancreatic cancer. He was diagnosed in January and gone by April, which is the kind of timeline that doesn't leave room for preparation or acceptance or any of the things grief counselors tell you that you need. It just leaves a hole. Wide and sudden and permanent. Daddy wasn't a wealthy man. He drove a delivery truck for 31 years, and he was proud of that. But he was careful with money in a way that most people in our family never were. When he died, he left me $18,000. Not a fortune, but enough. If I was disciplined, if I was smart, if I was willing to do what nobody in my family had ever done before, and treat that money like a foundation instead of a relief, I used it as a down payment. I spent 3 months researching neighborhoods, loan rates, inspection requirements. I worked overtime every chance I got. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch for 6 months straight. I drove a car with a cracked windshield because I refused to touch my savings for anything that wasn't that house. And on a Thursday morning in late September, I sat across from a loan officer at a title company on Florida Boulevard, and I signed my name on papers that made me, Brielle Okafor, the sole owner of a 3-bedroom house on the east side of Baton Rouge. Louisiana, I cried in the parking lot afterward. Not sad crying. The other kind. The kind that comes from somewhere so deep in your chest that you didn't even know it was stored there. I called my father's memory the way you do when someone is gone and something good happens. That silent internal conversation where you just say, "Daddy, I did it." And I meant it. Ruth Ann's reaction when I told her was not what I expected. She smiled, said that was nice, and then immediately asked whether the guest bedroom had good closet space. I remember thinking that was a strange first question. I filed it away and forgot about it. For the first 2 years, I lived in that house alone, and it was the most peaceful I had ever felt in my adult life. I painted every room myself. I planted a small garden along the back fence. I learned how to fix a leaking faucet from a YouTube video at midnight and felt genuinely proud of myself the next morning. That house was not just property. It was the first place in my entire life where I felt like I belonged to myself completely. Then August came. Ruth Ann called me from her apartment on the other side of the city, her voice thin and frightened in a way that cut right through me. She said her chest had been hurting for 2 days. She said she hadn't told anyone because she didn't want to be a burden. She said she was scared. I drove to her immediately, took her to the emergency room myself, sat with her through every test, every waiting room, every conversation with every doctor. The diagnosis was a minor cardiac arrhythmia. Manageable, not immediately dangerous, but real enough to require monitoring and medication adjustment and a period of reduced stress. The doctor suggested she not live alone for a while. And I, because I am who I am, because Gerald raised me to believe that family shows up, I looked at my mother sitting small in that hospital bed and I said, "Come stay with me, Mama, just until you're stronger." She moved in 11 days later with 4 suitcases, 2 boxes of kitchen items she said she preferred to mine, and a potted plant she placed in my living room window without asking. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself she was scared and fragile and needed her daughter. What? I didn't tell myself what I refused to see was the way her eyes moved through every room of my house that first day, not with gratitude, with something quieter, something that looked, in hindsight, almost exactly like inventory. The first 3 months were manageable. Ruth Ann cooked sometimes, kept her room reasonably tidy, attended her cardiology follow-ups without complaint. There were moments, small, ordinary ones, where it almost felt like something good had come from something scary. We would sit on the back porch after dinner sometimes, watching the fireflies come out over my little garden, and she would tell me stories about my father when they were young. Those evenings felt like a gift, but somewhere around month 4, things began to shift. So gradually that I kept questioning whether I was imagining it. It started with the furniture. I came home one evening to find my living room rearranged. The couch had been pushed to the opposite wall. My reading chair, a worn brown leather armchair I had saved up for specifically because it was exactly what I wanted, had been moved into the corner like an afterthought. Ruth Ann had centered her own rocking chair. the one she'd brought from her apartment, directly in front of the television. When I asked her about it, she waved her hand and said the old arrangement gave her a stiff neck. She said it without looking up from her program. Like my opinion on the layout of my own living room was a formality she had already decided to skip. I moved my reading chair back the next morning. By the time I got home from work that evening, it was in the corner again. I let it go. I told myself she was elderly, she was recovering, and furniture placement was not worth conflict. I told myself I was being mature. What I was actually being was a door left slightly open. The invitation started next. Ruth Ann began having her friends over without asking me. 2, sometimes 3 women from her church group, sitting in my kitchen on Tuesday afternoons when I was at work. I would come home to find coffee cups in my sink and the particular kind of rearranged energy in a space that tells you people have been comfortable somewhere for hours. Once I came home to find a woman I had never met in my life, sitting in my reading chair eating a slice of pound cake off one of my good plates. Ruth Ann introduced her as Sister Vernell from the congregation. Sister Vernell smiled at me like I was the guest. I started noticing other things after that. Small things that individually meant nothing but collectively were beginning to form a picture I didn't want to look at directly. Ruth Ann started referring to the house differently in conversation. Not Brielle's house or even our house, just the house. As in, I was telling the ladies about the house. As in, I had someone come look at the house about that gutter situation. As in, I think the house could use a different color in the hallway. She had someone come look at the gutter situation without telling me. Without asking me. A man I did not know had walked around my property while I was at work because my mother had invited him. And she mentioned it to me the same way you mentioned that you picked up milk. Casually, incidentally. Like it required no acknowledgement from me at all. That was also around the time my brother Grayson started appearing. Grayson is 3 years younger than me. He is 31 years old and has held, by my last count, 9 different jobs since he turned 22. None of them lasted longer than 8 months. There was always a reason: a bad manager, an unfair situation, an opportunity that required him to be available. Ruth Ann had spent the better part of a decade making excuses for him with the kind of dedicated creativity that she never once applied to anything I needed from her. He had his own apartment across town, a place Ruth Ann helped him with the deposit on twice. Money she'd told me she didn't have when I was scraping together my down payment 4 years earlier. I had never said anything about that. I had swallowed it and kept moving, the way I always did, but now Grayson was showing up at my house on weekends. Then weekday evenings. Then one Saturday, I came back from grocery shopping to find him in my kitchen making himself a sandwich. Completely at ease, like he had a key I didn't know about. I asked Ruth Ann about it that night. She said, and I remember this precisely because I have replayed it many times since. She said, Grayson is family, Brielle. This is a family home. A family home. I stood in my own hallway and felt something cold move through me. Because she hadn't said it like a slip. She hadn't said it carelessly. She had said it with a particular firmness. The kind of firmness that tells you the person has been practicing that sentence, waiting for the right moment to use it. I went to my room that night and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time. My chest felt like something was sitting on it. Not panic. Something worse, the slow, creeping recognition that the ground beneath you has been shifting for a long time, and you are only now noticing how far you've already moved from where you started. I should have acted then. I know that now, but I loved her. She was my mother. And there is a particular kind of paralysis that comes from loving someone who is in the process of destroying you, because every instinct you have toward self-protection gets tangled up in history and guilt and the desperate hope that you are misreading the situation. So I waited, and while I waited, they planned. The 2 weeks before that October Tuesday were different. I felt it the way you feel a storm coming in Louisiana before the sky even changes. Something in the pressure. Something in the air that your body registers before your mind catches up. Grayson was coming over almost every day by then. He and Ruth Ann would go quiet when I entered a room. Not dramatically quiet, Not the kind of silence that announces itself. The subtle kind? The kind where the conversation doesn't stop, but the temperature of it changes. Where you walk in and there's a half-second adjustment, a topic pivot, a shift in posture that most people would never notice. I noticed. I had been trained my entire childhood to notice those shifts, because in our house growing up, those shifts meant something was about to happen to me. I started paying closer attention. One evening I came home earlier than usual. A shift cancellation. Nobody's fault, and I heard them in the kitchen before they heard me. Ruth Ann's voice was low but distinct. She was saying something about waiting until the right moment and she won't make a scene, you know how she is. Grayson said something I couldn't fully catch, and then Ruth Ann said, "Clear as anything. It's not really hers alone anyway. Gerald would have wanted us all taken care of." I stood in my own hallway, work bag still on my shoulder, and I did not move for a full 10 seconds. Then I walked into the kitchen like I had heard nothing. Because the one thing I had learned about people like Ruth Ann and Grayson, people who operate in quiet calculations, is that they are most dangerous when they know you are aware. If they knew I had heard that, they would accelerate. They would move before I could, so I smiled. Said I was home early, asked what was for dinner. Ruth Ann smiled back. Grayson nodded at his phone. And the three of us sat in my kitchen eating reheated red beans and rice like nothing was rotting underneath us. 3 days later, I noticed my important documents had been moved. I keep a fireproof lockbox on the top shelf of my bedroom closet. My deed, my insurance papers, my father's death certificate, my trust documentation. I am particular about that box in the way that people who have built something from nothing tend to be particular about the proof of it. I checked it every few months just out of habit. That Thursday evening I went to reach for it and it was shifted, not missing, just moved. A few inches to the left, like someone had picked it up, looked at it, and set it back not quite perfectly. The small combination lock on the front was intact. They hadn't gotten in, but they had tried to understand what was inside it. I took the box to my car that night while Ruth Ann was watching television. Drove to my bank the next morning before my shift and put everything in a safety deposit box. I told no one. When I got home from that bank visit, I called Roxanne. Roxanne Delacroix had been my closest friend since we were both new hires at the hospital 7 years ago. She had gone back to school 4 years into her nursing career and gotten her law degree. One of the most quietly determined people I have ever known in my life. She wasn't a real estate attorney specifically, but she knew enough, and more importantly, she knew exactly who to call when she didn't. I told her what I had been observing. The furniture. The friends. Grayson showing up. The comment about the family home. The moved lockbox. My voice was steady when I told her all of it, because I had been holding it together for months, and I had gotten very good at steady. Roxanne was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then she said, "Brielle, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not confront them yet. Document everything starting right now. Dates, times, exactly what was said. And I need you to get me a copy of your deed and your trust paperwork as soon as possible." I told her the paperwork was already in a safety deposit box. She exhaled. Then she said, "Good. That might have just saved you." The following Monday, Roxanne connected me with a property attorney named Mr. Fontenot, who specialized in exactly these kinds of situations. He reviewed my trust documentation in 48 hours and called me back with a tone of voice that was both completely professional and deeply reassuring. He said the structure was ironclad. He said that without my explicit written consent, not a single person on earth had any legal claim to that property or any right to alter access to it. I thanked him. Hung up. Sat in my car in the hospital parking garage for a moment with my eyes closed. Then I went in and worked my shift. All 10 hours of it. I triaged patients and processed imaging orders and smiled at colleagues and did my job with complete focus, the way I always did. Because whatever was happening at home was not going to take this from me, too. That was the Monday. Tuesday was when I came home and my key didn't work. I had known something was coming. I had been preparing for something. But there is a difference, a vast physical, gut-level difference, between knowing a wave is coming and actually feeling it hit you. Standing on that porch, watching my mother's face disappear behind my curtain, all of the steadiness I had been carrying for weeks cracked just slightly at the edges. Not enough for anyone to see. But I felt it. I sat on my porch steps and the sky went dark around me, and I let myself feel it for exactly as long as it took the streetlights to come on. Then I picked up my phone and I stopped being the daughter who waited. I called Roxanne first. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been waiting. Maybe not for this specifically, but she had been waiting for the call that told her something had finally broken open. I kept my voice low and even. I told her I was sitting on my own porch steps in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, at 7:30 in the evening, locked out of my own house by a lock my mother had changed while I was at work. I told her Ruth Ann's car was in the driveway. The lights were on inside, and that my mother had looked at me through my own window and walked away. There was a beat of silence. Then Roxanne said, she actually did it, not surprised exactly. More like someone who had been watching a car roll slowly toward a cliff edge and had just heard the impact. She told me not to bang on the door, not to call Ruth Ann again, not to raise my voice or give them anything they could later characterize as threatening or unstable. She said, I know that is the hardest thing I could possibly ask you right now, and I need you to do it anyway. I said I understood. She said she was calling Mr. Fontenot immediately and that I should expect to hear from her within the hour. I sat on those steps and I waited. A moth circled the porch light above me. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at nothing. The air smelled like cut grass and the particular thick warmth that Baton Rouge holds even in October, like the city itself refuses to let summer go without an argument. 40 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Roxanne, and her voice had shifted into the tone I had heard her use when she was no longer a friend talking to a friend, but an attorney talking to a client. She said, Okay, here is exactly where you stand. She explained what I already knew in outline but needed to hear in precise legal language. The house was held in a revocable living trust that I had established 2 years ago on the advice of a co-worker whose elderly mother had done something similar to her sister. In that trust, I was both the grantor and the sole trustee. The property belonged entirely and exclusively to the trust, which meant it belonged entirely and exclusively to me. There was no joint ownership. There were no secondary beneficiaries with current rights. There was no legal mechanism by which Ruth Ann or Grayson or anyone else could claim any authority over that property while I was alive and competent. What Ruth Ann had done by changing those locks was not just cruel. It was illegal. Specifically, Mr. Fontenot had identified it as an unlawful lockout, a violation under Louisiana property law that applied even in situations where the person changing the locks was a resident of the property, because residency without ownership carried no right to restrict the owner's access. Ruth Ann was a guest in my home, a guest with no lease, no legal agreement, no documented rights whatsoever. She had changed the locks on a property she had zero legal standing over. Roxanne told me that Mr. Fontenot was drafting a formal notice that night. She told me that I had every right to contact the Baton Rouge Police Department and request an officer escort to re-enter my property. She told me to document everything, photograph the new lock, note the time, write down Mr. Thibodeau's reaction across the street because even that could matter. She told me to find somewhere safe and comfortable to sleep that night, and that by tomorrow morning, everything would begin moving in my direction. I took pictures of the lock. I wrote notes in my phone with timestamps. I texted Roxanne 3 photographs and a written summary of everything that had happened from the moment I arrived home. Then I drove to a hotel on Airline Highway, a clean, quiet place with a decent bed and a bathroom where nobody had rearranged anything. And I sat on the edge of that hotel bed in my work scrubs, and I finally let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not because I was broken, but because I had been holding so much steadiness for so many months that my body needed a moment to remember it was allowed to feel things, I cried for about 12 minutes. Hard, specific crying. Not the lost kind, but the kind that comes from finally being honest with yourself about how much something hurt. I cried for my father Gerald, who had given me that money so I could build something safe, and whose memory was now entangled in this ugliness. I cried for the version of myself that had stood in a hospital room 14 months ago and looked at her sick mother and felt nothing but love and the instinct to protect. I cried for that woman because she deserved it. Then I washed my face, ordered food to the room, opened my laptop and began typing out a detailed written account of every incident I could remember going back 14 months. Dates, words used, witnesses where applicable, my emotional state, the specific language Ruth Ann had used, every rearranged piece of furniture, every uninvited guest, every time Grayson had appeared, the conversation I had overheard in the kitchen, the moved lockbox, all of it I typed until past midnight. Then I slept better than I had in months, because there is something that happens to your nervous system when you stop absorbing someone else's aggression and start responding to it. Something that loosens, something that straightens. I had spent 14 months being patient and careful and kind in a situation that did not deserve any of those things from me. I had given Ruth Ann my home, my time, my worry, my silence. I had watched her slowly try to take everything my father's hard work and my own sacrifice had built, and I had kept giving her the benefit of a doubt she had never once earned. That was over now. Not with anger, not with revenge fantasies or dramatic confrontation plans, just with the clean, quiet certainty of a woman who knows exactly what she owns, exactly what she is owed, and exactly what she is about to do about it. Tomorrow was coming. And I was ready. I was up before 6 the next morning. Showered, dressed, ate a proper breakfast at the hotel restaurant. Eggs, toast, coffee, with the deliberate calm of someone who has made a decision and is no longer afraid of it. My phone was already showing 2 missed calls from Ruth Ann. No voicemails. Just the calls themselves, which told me everything. She had expected panic. She had expected me to come back to that door last night, desperate and negotiating. When I didn't, the silence had started to feel different to her. Good. Roxanne called me at 7:45. She said Mr. Fontenot had finalized the formal notice the previous night and it was ready to be served. She said she had already been in contact with the Baton Rouge Police Department's non-emergency line and explained the situation to a supervisor who confirmed that what Ruth Ann had done constituted an unlawful lockout under Louisiana, revised statute 93258, and that an officer could accompany me to re-enter my property within my legal rights as the sole owner of record. She asked me how I was feeling. I told her I was steady. She said, "Good, because today is going to require every bit of that." We agreed to meet at my house at 10 a.m. Roxanne would be there. Mr. Fontenot's assistant would arrive separately to serve the formal notice. And a Baton Rouge PD officer, Officer Tran, Roxanne told me. A woman who had handled these situations before and understood the specific dynamics involved, would meet us at the property. I arrived on my street at 9:58 and parked 2 houses down. I sat in my car and watched my house for a moment. Ruth Ann's Buick was still in the driveway. Grayson's beat-up gray truck was parked directly behind it. He had apparently moved in overnight, which told me they had been operating on the assumption that possession was most of the battle. That if they could just hold the space long enough, I would eventually accept a negotiation on their terms. They had fundamentally misread who they were dealing with. Roxanne pulled up beside me at 10 exactly, impeccable as always in a dark blazer, her natural hair pinned back. Her expression, the particular kind of controlled that I had learned, meant she was prepared for anything. She squeezed my hand once through my car window. Didn't say anything dramatic. Just, "Ready?" And I said yes. Officer Tran arrived 2 minutes later in a marked patrol unit. She was composed, professional, and introduced herself with the kind of measured efficiency that immediately told me she had done this before and had no patience for nonsense from either direction. She reviewed the ownership documentation Roxanne provided. copy of the trust deed and the property records, and confirmed clearly that I had full legal right to re-enter and that she was there to ensure that process happened without incident. Mr. Fontenot's assistant arrived at 10:08 with the formal notice documents. We walked to the front door together, me, Roxanne, Officer Tran. The morning was already warm the way Baton Rouge mornings are in October. That soft, heavy warmth that sits on your shoulders like something almost kind. The oak trees along my street were completely still. Everything felt very clear and very quiet. I knocked on my own front door. There was a long pause. Long enough that Officer Tran raised her eyebrow slightly. Then I heard movement inside. Quick, shuffling. The sound of two people moving through a space in a hurry. Then the door opened. Ruth Ann opened it. She had clearly been awake for hours. Her hair was done, her housecoat replaced with actual clothes, which told me she had been preparing for some version of this moment, even if she hadn't known exactly what form it would take. She looked at me first, then at Roxanne, then at Officer Tran. And I watched her face move through 4 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, the beginning of a performance, and then something underneath all of that, which I can only describe as the specific fear of someone who has just realized the plan has failed. She opened her mouth, Officer. Tran spoke first. She identified herself, stated clearly that she was present because the property owner, me, had been unlawfully denied access to her own home through an unauthorized lock change, and that she was there to facilitate the owner's re-entry and to ensure the situation remained peaceful. She said it without drama, without accusation, in the flat professional tone of someone reading from a document they have memorized. Ruth Ann said, "This is a family matter." Officer Tran said, "Ma'am, under Louisiana law, this is a property matter, and the property belongs to your daughter." Grayson appeared behind Ruth Ann then. He was still in a wrinkled t-shirt, hair uncombed, and when he saw the officer, he went a particular shade of pale that told me he had not actually thought this through beyond the initial move. He had assumed, the way people like Grayson always assume, that boldness in the first moment was the same thing as having a plan. It is not Mr. Fontenot's. Assistant stepped forward and formally served both, Ruth Ann and Grayson, with the legal notice, a document that outlined the unlawful lockout, asserted my full ownership rights under the trust, demanded the immediate return of any copies of keys made without my authorization, and formally initiated a 30-day vacate notice requiring both of them to remove themselves and their belongings from my property within 30 days. Grayson looked at the papers like they were in a foreign language. Then he looked at Ruth Ann. And for the first time in my entire life, I watched my mother have absolutely nothing to say. The locksmith Roxanne had arranged arrived at 10:20. While he worked on installing the new lock, my lock, chosen by me, keyed only to me, I walked into my own house for the first time in nearly 24 hours. I walked through every room, not looking for damage, not cataloging what they had touched or moved or helped themselves to. Just walking through my own space, feeling the floors under my feet, the particular quality of the light through my own windows, the smell of my own home. Behind me, I could hear Ruth Ann beginning to cry. The soft, practiced kind that had worked on me for 34 years. Grayson's voice, low and urgent, saying something to her I couldn't fully make out. Officer Tran's calm presence making sure everything stayed exactly as orderly as it needed to be. I stood in my kitchen, with my plants on the windowsill and my father's old coffee mug on the shelf where I had always kept it, and I breathed, just breathed. The 30 days that followed were not easy. I want to be honest about that, because this is not the kind of story where justice arrives and everything immediately feels clean and simple. Real life does not work that way. Real healing does not work that way. Ruth Ann called me 11 times in the first 3 days after the notice was served. I answered twice. The first call she cried the entire time, the deep, heaving kind that used to make me feel like the walls were closing in, like I was responsible for every tear regardless of what had caused them. She said I was tearing the family apart. She said my father would be ashamed of me. She said she had given me her whole life and this was how I repaid her. I listened to all of it. And when she finished, I said very quietly, "Mama, you changed the locks on my house. You planned it with my brother. You went through my documents. And you did all of it while I was at work, taking care of patients, paying the mortgage on the home you were living in for free. I love you, and you still have to go." Then I hung up. The second call was 3 days later. This time her voice was different, harder, stripped of the performance. She said Grayson had told her I had always been selfish, that I had always thought I was better than the family, that buying this house had been about proving something rather than actually caring about anyone. She said maybe he was right. I felt that one land. I won't pretend I didn't. There is a specific kind of pain in hearing your mother tell you that your brother's cruelty might be the accurate version of you. It sits in a place that logic cannot immediately reach. But I had learned something important in the previous months. The fact that something hurts does not mean it is true. I said, "I hope you both find somewhere comfortable, Mama," and I ended the call. After that, I stopped answering. Roxanne checked in with me every few days. Mr. Fontenot monitored the situation legally. On the 26th day, Ruth Ann and Grayson finally moved their belongings out. Not gracefully, not quietly, but with the kind of loud, performative suffering that was designed to be witnessed by the neighbors, by anyone watching, by whatever audience they could gather for their version of events. Grayson carried boxes with the energy of a man being wrongfully evicted from his own kingdom. Ruth Ann paused on my porch on her last trip out and looked at me. I was standing in the doorway, with an expression that I think was meant to devastate me. It didn't, not because I didn't love her, but because I had finally understood something that took me 34 years and 14 months of slow invasion to learn. Love is not the same thing as access. Loving someone does not mean they get to walk through every door of your life without permission. It does not mean you owe them the thing you built with your own grief and your own sacrifice and your own two hands. Love is not a liability that other people get to collect on whenever they decide they need it. The evening after they left, I went through the house slowly. Opened every window. Let the October air move through every room. I found small things they had left behind. A coffee mug of Ruth Ann's on the wrong shelf. One of Grayson's jackets hanging on a hook by the back door like he had expected to return for it. I put them in a box on the porch and sent Grayson a text telling him it was there. He picked it up 2 days later without knocking. That night I sat in my reading chair, back in its proper place in the living room, exactly where I had always wanted it, and I looked around at my house in the quiet. My plants on the windowsills. My father's coffee mug back on its shelf. The painting I had chosen for the hallway. The garden out back that I had planted myself and that had kept growing through all of it, indifferent to the chaos inside, just quietly doing what it was supposed to do. I thought about Gerald. About that Thursday morning at the title company on Florida Boulevard when I had signed my name and then cried in the parking lot. About what he had intended when he left me that money. Not a gift exactly, more like a message. Like he had known, the way fathers sometimes know, that I was going to need a foundation that was entirely mine. That nobody could touch. That would hold. It held, Daddy. It held. I changed the locks myself that weekend. Went to the hardware store on a Saturday morning, watched 3 tutorial videos, and installed the new deadbolt with my own hands. It took me longer than it should have, and I stripped one screw slightly and had to start over. And when it was finally done and I turned the key and felt the bolt slide home cleanly, I stood there for a moment with my hand still on the door. My door. My lock. My key. There are things that people like Ruth Ann and Grayson never understand about the women they underestimate. They see patience and they call it weakness. They see generosity and they call it opportunity. They see a woman who has never raised her voice in a conflict and they decide she has no weapons. But here is what I know now. Sitting in my own house on the east side of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in the quiet that I earned, the most powerful thing I ever did was not the confrontation. It was not the attorney or the Officer or the formal notice or the 30-day clock, it was the Tuesday 2 years before all of this when a coworker told me her family story over lunch in the hospital break room, and I went home that night and made one phone call and set up one trust and thought, just in case. Just in case the people I love most turn out to need boundaries I haven't built yet. That one quiet Tuesday saved everything. If you are in a situation right now where something feels off, where someone is treating your kindness like a key they found on the ground, where you are making yourself smaller in spaces you built, please hear me when I say this. You do not have to wait until the lock is already changed. You do not have to wait until you are sitting on your own porch steps in the dark to start protecting what is yours. Quiet preparation is not paranoia. It is self-respect with a plan, and sometimes, it is the thing that means when they finally make their move, the only person left standing at that door holding a valid key is you.